All right, welcome back, guys, to Unit 13, The Gathering Storm, the terrible 1850s. Just to kind of review what we're doing here. We're looking at what I've called the worst decade in American history, just really a decade from hell. And again, what we're looking at is a series of events that unfold throughout the 1850s that drive the wedge between North and South so deep that we're going to wind up with an American Civil War by the end of the decade. And we've already covered part one and covered part two. What we're going to do now is finish out this unit with part three, and we're going to look at something known as John Brown's Raid, the election of 1860, Crittenden Compromise, and then ultimately secession. Okay, so I know I just said it, but I'm going to say it again. So what we're going to do in part three here is look at kind of a few events that take place at the very end of this decade of the 1850s, and just to kind of set the groundwork here, guys, by the time we get to 1859, after everything we've talked about so far in this unit, the nation was essentially a powder keg. It was just ready to blow. And in 1859, an event that occurs in Virginia is going to set the nation on fire. And it's known as John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So we're going to start with John Brown's Raid and then talk about how this filters into the election of 1860. And then we'll talk about why that election was so important. And then we'll finish up by talking about an event known as the Crittenden Compromise, and then ultimately the secession of the Lower South. But John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So the way we'll approach this is I want to kind of give you the background to this raid, what it was, who it involved, then talk about the raid itself and how it went, and what came of it, and then ultimately what was significant about all of this. So let's go ahead and jump into the background to John Brown's Raid. It's called John Brown's Raid because it is perpetrated by John Brown. Now, we've already seen John Brown already in this course, and actually in this unit when we were discussing the events of Bleeding Kansas. If you don't remember, I mean, John Brown was a New England radical abolitionist, and he had come from a family history of, well, a lot of people in his family were insane. John Brown, though, John Brown, his heart was in the right place when it came to slavery. He was very much against it. He believed that slavery was a sin, that it was against God, and that God was eventually going to punish the United States for slavery unless it was ended. And this is what led him then to the Kansas Territory and led him to the events at Pottawatomie Creek, Kansas, in which he and his men massacred a handful of pro-slavery settlers from Missouri that were moving into the Kansas Territory. This is really where he made a name for himself, and everybody in Kansas knew that he had perpetrated these events, but he had kind of gone into hiding since Bleeding Kansas. And the reason he had gone into hiding since Bleeding Kansas was he was making preparations for a grand plan to end slavery in this country. Again, touching on the fact that Brown was a relatively obscure person before the events of Bleeding Kansas, he was a die-hard radical abolitionist. He truly did believe that he was put on this earth to end slavery and to end it by any means necessary. So between the events of Bleeding Kansas and 1859, John Brown had been developing a plan to eventually end slavery in this country so that the nation, as he believed it, would not be bathed and baptized in blood as he believed it was going to. Let me briefly describe what his plan to end slavery entailed. Now, you see on this slide here, this is a map of northern Virginia. And kind of down on in the right-hand corner, you can see our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Well, just outside of Washington, D.C., in what is today West Virginia, but in 1859, West Virginia doesn't exist yet, there was a town in Virginia, northern Virginia, that was Harper's Ferry. And John Brown came up with a plan to, under the cover of darkness, he and about 20 men would sneak into this town and seize a federal arsenal that was located in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. An arsenal is just this is where the U.S. Army was storing some artillery, some guns, some ammunition. This is why Harper's Ferry was chosen as the target for a raid in which they would seize all of these guns and then distribute these guns to slaves that lived in and around Harper's Ferry. In effect, he's hoping to create kind of a slave army here. His plan doesn't stop there, though. His plan was to eventually march this slave army south into the mountains of northern Georgia, where he would then wage a guerrilla war, launching raids into the South and stirring up slave rebellions in the hope that this would undermine slavery from within. Now, if this plan sounds crazy, it's because it absolutely is crazy. The moment he decides to do this plan, he will be committing treason, and the likelihood of his plan to work is very slim. But this was his plan. I told you, John Brown's heart is in the right place, but he's not exactly a sane person. He is correct. Slavery's wrong. It should end. But the means by which he's about to go to are, even by today's standards, extremely radical. Again, he's hoping that he will start a slave rebellion in the Deep South, and this will just end slavery across the nation and put an end to it all. He's hoping to end slavery by undermining it from within. So how did the plan unfold? Well, let me tell you about the raid itself. And I'm about to be clicking through a lot of slides, but the story is one of the most fantastic stories in American history, and its repercussions are going to be immense. So, the raid itself. Again, after years of planning, John Brown and about 20 of his followers will cross from the state of Maryland into Virginia, into Harper's Ferry. And here's a picture of Harper's Ferry today. Here's the bridge they crossed. They will cross under the cover of darkness into Harper's Ferry. They will very quickly seize the federal arsenal. It's actually ironic what happened here, because almost as soon as they launched this plan, it began to break down. They were immediately spotted while breaking into the federal arsenal by a slave living in Harper's Ferry. And to keep the slave quiet, they actually had to kill the slave. So his rebellion to end slavery is not off to a great start. What happened next, as you can see on this picture, that there's railroads that lead into Harper's Ferry. Well, at the time of their break-in to the federal arsenal, a train was pulling into Harper's Ferry, and the authorities on the train realized what was going on. And the train, of course, quickly sped away on its way to Washington, D.C. More about that train in a little bit. Well, as soon as they had broken into the federal arsenal, and as soon as it became clear what was going on here in Harper's Ferry, that's really when the plan began to break down. Here's a picture of Harper's Ferry in 1859 after the raid. The federal arsenal is there on the right-hand side, one with a large chimney. This was the target, and they did, in fact, break in and seize a lot of weapons. But it's at that point that the plan began to break down. Soon, citizens of Harper's Ferry quickly realized what was happening. And one of the most dangerous places to be in the South during the era of slavery was anywhere somebody yelled the word slave rebellion, which is what began to be cried out here in Harper's Ferry. And what happened is, here was the fatal flaw in Brown's plan, is that he never accounted that Southerners might resist this plan. And so when the citizens of Harper's Ferry realized what Brown and his men were up to, they grabbed their guns and they forced John Brown's men into the local firehouse, which there it is today, still stands today. There it is today. And then on the right-hand side, there's a depiction of Brown and his men being holed up and surrounded inside the firehouse. So his plan has already begun to break down. He is now cornered inside the firehouse. Meanwhile, what about that train that left Harper's Ferry? Well, that train soon arrived in the early morning the next day in Washington, D.C., and the authorities on that train let know what was happening in Harper's Ferry. Very quickly, the President of the United States, his name was James Buchanan, he is told what is happening in Harper's Ferry. Now, what is happening is a rebellion against the federal government because they have broken into and seized federal weapons. Buchanan then must use the military to put down this rebellion. And President Buchanan was scrambling to find someone to be able to lead some soldiers out to Harper's Ferry to put an end to all of this nonsense. The only officer he could find that day in Washington, D.C. was a young colonel in the U.S. Army by the name of Robert E. Lee. And the reason Lee was chosen is because he lived just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. His home still stands today. It's Arlington National Cemetery. So Lee was pegged by President Buchanan to lead a regiment of soldiers, and the only soldiers they could find at Washington, D.C. that day was actually a regiment of Marines. So Lee and a regiment of Marines will head out to Harper's Ferry via the railroad. They will arrive in Harper's Ferry by mid-afternoon, and they will then surround the firehouse. They give John Brown an ultimatum of surrender, or they will assault the firehouse. John Brown says he will not surrender, so the Marines assault the firehouse. The assault was over very quickly. They were able to bust through the doors relatively easily. And Brown was wounded, he was captured, many of his men died during the assault. Brown himself was stabbed and shot, but he lived. He was captured, and now he is going to be put on trial facing charges of treason. As will others that were with him that day that assaulted and raided Harper's Ferry. So that was the raid, but the story's not really over, because the trial now of John Brown really did capture the nation's attention. It really turned into a fiasco. But you can see this picture here on the left. At the very bottom, right in the middle, you see a man laying down on kind of a cot. Well, that's John Brown. He was wounded, and he actually represented himself at this trial. And during his trial was really where John Brown kind of became a martyr for many people in this country. During the trial, he stated that yes, he had in fact carried out this raid, that he was guilty. By the way, if you're ever facing charges of treason, you should never admit to them and never represent yourself. But Brown's not exactly the most sane person in the world. So during this trial, he states that he did it, and that if he was freed, he would do it again. Don't ever do that either. During this trial, he warned that God was going to purge the United States with blood because of slavery, and that slavery was going to lead to the downfall of this country. Now, in the end, he was found guilty for obvious reasons, and in late December 1859, he and 6 other of his followers were hanged. Let me tell you about these 6 other followers. During this trial, John Brown did admit that he had carried this out, but during the trial, it was revealed that he had had help in planning and executing this plan. In fact, during the trial, it was revealed that 6 prominent abolitionists knew of and aided in his raid. They had provided money, they had kept his plan a secret. They were found subsequently just as guilty of treason as he was. Now, more on this in just one second. So in the end, Brown and his 6 cohorts here, they were all hanged on charges of treason. And here's a picture of Brown, of course, painting of Brown coming out of the courthouse after he has been found guilty, and there is a etching of Brown walking up the gallows. So in December 1859, Brown is found guilty of treason, and he and 6 of his followers are hanged. So there's the background, there's the raid. What is significant about this raid? Well, a few things. And remember, I told you at the beginning of this that the nation really is, by 1859, just a powder keg waiting to blow. And John Brown's raid really is what sets it all off. The significance of John Brown's raid is kind of twofold here. The best way to understand it is to look at the way the North reacted to Brown's raid and its trial and his execution, and look at how the South reacted to John Brown's raid. Let's do the North first. In the North, after his trial and the things he said in this trial, Brown really became, for a lot of people in the North, a martyr, and many championed him as a hero. For what he had pulled off. They could commend a man believing this much in something, that he was willing to go that far. And so for a lot of people in the North, he became kind of this martyr and a champion. And the remnants of this still exist today. Across the northern states, you will find in many small towns and some large cities monuments erected during this time period, all in honor of John Brown. So in the North, he really achieved martyrdom and martyr status. I'll give you another example. The great poet, American poet Ralph Waldo Emerson had actually compared Brown in an editorial to Jesus Christ, and you can see that he declared that his death had made the gallows just as glorious as the cross. So in the North, Brown is kind of championed as this martyr and as this hero for what he has done, believing so much that slavery was so wrong that he was willing to go to this extremes. But what about the South? Guys, in the South, John Brown's raid was absolutely terrifying. What Southerners feared above all else concerning their institution of slavery was a slave rebellion, and this was a slave rebellion, and it was an attempt to launch a gigantic slave rebellion. So Brown's raid was absolutely terrifying in the South, and even more terrifying for Southerners was the revelation that he had been helped in this attack. And not only that, but he was now considered a hero and a martyr by many in the North. So the South is looking at this raid saying, this was an attempt to kill many, many people through launching a slave rebellion. This was an act of terrorism. And what's even more terrifying was that he had had help doing it. This was not a lone wolf attack. And it gave the impression to Southerners that John Brown was only the beginning. That there would be more John Browns in the future. And that was aided by the fact that he had been helped. That there were people in the North that knew he was doing stuff like this and were helping him do it. And now they're watching the North consider this man a martyr and a hero. By today's standards, he would be labeled, of course, a terrorist. But you know the old saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And that's really what's going on here. So ultimately what's significant about John Brown's raid is that, in the North he's a martyr. But in the South, the raid convinced many Southerners that they are now no longer safe in the Union. And it moved many Southerners closer to the idea that secession may be the only means by which to protect themselves. So the raid's significance is that it moves Southerners closer to the idea of secession. Okay, so like I said, by 1859, the nation really is this powder keg, and John Brown's raid has really lit the wick of this powder keg, which is likely to explode. We have seen all these divisive events that have put a wedge between North and South and have alienated them from one another so much that the nation is ripe for conflict. The American people are so divided by the end of this decade that it's the perfect time, obviously, to have a presidential election. All right, so we finish out the major events here of the 1850s by looking at the election of 1860. This election is considered one of the most important elections in American history for reasons that will become clear here in a second. But I want everybody to understand kind of the dynamics that are going on in this election. So the way we're going to approach this election is by talking about the major candidates, the major parties, and the major platforms. And then I want to talk a little bit about the Democratic Party in this election, because they do something that is going to end up costing them this election. And then ultimately I want to discuss what's significant about the election. So let's talk about some major candidates, parties, and platforms. And the first party I want to talk about is the Republican Party. The Republican Party in the election of 1860 was purely a northern party. In most of the southern states, the Republican Party candidate wasn't even on the ballot. The candidate the Republican Party decided upon in 1860, it was believed it would be a man named William Seward, but it did not become William Seward. Instead, it became Abraham Lincoln, somebody that Northerners were intimately aware of as a result of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but also Southerners intimately aware of. He is the Republican candidate in the 1860 presidential election. His platform and the party's platform was very simple. They were 100% opposed to slavery's expansion. Now, I cannot be more clear on this. This party in the 1860 election made it very publicly known that they were not against slavery where it already existed. They had no intention, nor did they think they had the authority to end slavery anywhere it already existed. The party simply opposed the expansion of slavery. That was it. That's all it was. So this, of course, means that they were opposed to the Dred Scott decision, but they also had things in their platforms like they stood for a protective tariff, which makes this party very pro-business, pro-Northeast. But the biggest issue here in this election was slavery's expansion, and the Republican Party is 100% opposed to it. There was also a third party in this election. I'll handle the Democrats here in a second. There was also a third party in this election. You know, the country was so divided here heading into this presidential election that we got the rise of a third party known as the Constitutional Union Party. And this party was a middle-of-the-road party in both ideology and geography. Their candidate they ran was from Kentucky, one of the middle states between the North and the Deep South. And his name is John Bell. There he is on the side. So they were geographically a middle-of-the-road party, but ideologically they also were a middle-of-the-road party. They were a very moderate party, and they were filled with some of the elder statesmen of American politics, Bell included. So instead of a platform, what they really did is they ran on the fact that they were the older, more sensible, more moderate statesmen of the United States political system. They argued that the American people just need to accept the Dred Scott decision because the Supreme Court had ruled it. They stood for the status quo. Nobody do anything stupid. They were very much against secession, very much in favor of maintaining the Union, and very much supporting the Constitution. So this was a very middle-of-the-road party, very middle-of-the-road ideological party as well. But the third party, the Constitutional Union Party. So we know about the Republicans, we know about the Constitutional Union Party. What about the Democrats? Well, guys, here's what's interesting in this election. The single biggest issue in this election was the expansion of slavery. We know where the Republicans stand on it. We know what the Constitutional Unionist Party stands for. But the expansion of slavery ends up dividing the Democratic Party in the 1860 election, and this was their fatal flaw. What happened here is that the Democrats were divided over who should be their candidate. Northern Democrats wanted to nominate Stephen A. Douglas, the guy from the Lincoln-Douglas debates from Illinois. But Southern Democrats were not willing to accept Stephen A. Douglas because he would not endorse the Dred Scott decision. And if you remember, the reason he won't endorse Dred Scott decision is because he is still clinging to that idea of popular sovereignty. And Southern Democrats demanded that if he wants them to support him, he's going to have to accept the Dred Scott decision, something Stephen A. Douglas simply was not willing to do. So what happened here in this election is that the Southern Democrats split from the party. And so what we wind up with here from the Democratic Party is two candidates, one from the North and one from the South. Let me talk to you about these Northern Democrats. They, of course, went ahead and nominated Stephen A. Douglas. There he is. Their platform on the issue of slavery's expansion was what Douglas had always been arguing: popular sovereignty. Reborn again, of course, through his Freeport Doctrine that we saw him bring out in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Because this was what he stood for, this is why Southern Democrats could not support him. So Northern Democrats went ahead and nominated him. Southern Democrats nominated a Southerner from Kentucky, a man by the name of John C. Breckinridge. He was actually the vice president at the time for James Buchanan. And their platform, in terms of slavery's expansion, what they were calling for was a constitutional amendment that would take that Dred Scott decision and enshrine it and institutionalize it. Meaning they wanted a constitutional amendment that guaranteed slavery's expansion into all the territories, that it could not be limited. So here's what's happening. You have a Republican Party that stands 100% opposed to slavery's expansion, and a purely Northern Party. You have the Constitutional Union Party that is saying, accept the Dred Scott decision, and let's just move on. You have a Northern Democratic Party that is pushing the idea still of popular sovereignty. And this is dividing the Democratic Party because Southerners can't accept that. They have the Dred Scott decision. And what's interesting is that the single biggest issue was slavery's expansion. And the position to take on this issue, the position that'll most likely get you elected, the most popular position, was the position felt by the vast majority of Northerners. And we've seen that Northerners were on board and supportive of limiting slavery's expansion. And the best hope here to prevent the Republicans from winning would have been a solidified and unified Democratic Party, but that didn't happen. And as a result, since the Democrats were split, a Republican Party victory was all but assured. And here's a political cartoon that illustrates this. There's Douglas and his vice presidential candidate on one side, and Breckinridge and his vice presidential candidate on another side. The wagon in the middle says the Democratic platform. It's being pulled two ways, and there's, of course, Lincoln and the Republicans coming down the tracks. Here's what happened in the 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln carried every single free state. He did not need to win a single state that allowed slavery. That would have been enough to win the presidential election, and he carried every single one of them because him and his party were willing to take the most popular position on slavery's expansion, meaning not allow it to expand. So in the 1860 election, the electoral vote came down to 180 for Lincoln, 72 for Breckinridge, 39 for Bell, and 12 for Douglas. And Lincoln wins the 1860 presidential election. But what's significant about it? Why should you care about this election? The results of this election convinces 7 states of the Deep South to leave the Union by seceding. Immediately after Lincoln's election, 7 slave states of the Deep South will begin making preparations to secede. These states are going to secede based solely on Lincoln's election. They were not willing to wait around to see what he would do once he's inaugurated. They were not willing to live one single minute under his presidency. And the reason for that is they believed that what had just happened, the election of a candidate that was 100% opposed to slavery's expansion, represented a revolution of the government. And what they were about to do was to counter that revolution. Now here's what I really mean by this. Southerners have sat here for the last 10 years of the 1850s and watched and heard a Northern people talk about how they want to restrict the expansion of slavery. Well, after the Dred Scott decision, Southerners believed the issue was over. But then they hear Northerners making the argument that they would like to overturn the Dred Scott decision. And what Southerners are really hearing is that if they can overturn the Dred Scott decision, Northerners intend to violate the constitutional rights of Southerners by limiting their property into the territories. And for 7 of these slave states, that was dangerous enough. The fear here was, if they will do that, what else could Lincoln and the Republicans do? And of course, the ultimate fear was that they would not stop at limiting slavery's expansion into the territories, that eventually Lincoln and the Republicans would come after slavery where it already existed. So the results here of this election convinced 7 states Deep South to go ahead and begin making preparations to secede from the Union. In the meantime, however, there was an attempt to stop the whole process. There was an attempt to prevent secession. And it comes at the very tail end of 1860 as these southern states are beginning to prepare to leave the Union. There was an attempt to compromise here. And I want to talk about this because this really was, I just want you to understand that there were people that were trying to prevent a catastrophe. People understood how serious the crisis is getting, and there were attempts to stop it all from happening. And the most famous of them is known as the Crittenden Compromise. The Crittenden Compromise is named after a U.S. Senator from Kentucky. Here he is. His name is John J. Crittenden. He had actually taken over the seat that Henry Clay had vacated when Henry Clay retired from politics. And as we know, Henry Clay was that great compromiser. And so a lot of people looked towards Kentucky and looked towards Crittenden to kind of live up to the old ghost of Henry Clay. So what Crittenden did here before these southern states left the Union, as they're beginning to prepare to do it, is he came up with kind of this last-ditch attempt, to kind of this Hail Mary to prevent secession by proposing a couple things. The first thing he proposed was that we would get a constitutional amendment that guaranteed slavery where it already existed, meaning guaranteed slavery in the states. This would be a constitutional amendment that would explicitly say slavery in the states is untouchable. And the reason he puts this into the compromise was to alleviate any fears Southerners had that the Republicans and Lincoln might one day come after slavery where it already existed. But that doesn't solve all the problems. The second part of the compromise is he argued that we should reinstitute the 3630 Missouri Compromise line and extend it all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And here's kind of a map of what he's arguing we should do. And what he's saying is that the same principle would apply here. All the territory below that line would be open to slavery. And all the territories north of that line, slavery would be prohibited. So see, what Crittenden's arguing here is kind of a way to calm everything down, as a way to just finish the issue. Now it's really interesting here because on that first part, the constitutional amendment guaranteeing slavery where it already existed, when that proposal was put before Lincoln and the Republican Party, they both agreed they would accept that. Again, just highlighting that Lincoln and the Republicans do not intend to attack slavery. They are not abolitionists. They simply don't want slavery to expand. So when the proposal to guarantee through a constitutional amendment slavery where it already existed, Lincoln was fine with it. But the second point, reinstituting the 3630 line and allowing slavery to expand to the territories south of it, that was something that Lincoln and the Republican Party could not accept. And the reason for that is that if he allowed slavery to expand through accepting this compromise, he would be going against everything that he had been elected upon. He had gone out and campaigned and ran on a platform of restricting slavery's expansion into the territories. And a majority of the American people agreed with him. He believed that he could not accept this compromise because it would be going against the will of the majority. It would destroy his party. It would end his political career. So when it came down to this Crittenden Compromise, Southerners were willing to accept it, but Lincoln just could not. And that's a result of he had won his election based on the fact that he wasn't going to let slavery expand. And if he agrees to this compromise, he will be allowing slavery to expand. And he believed this would do worse to the country than to just stop it. So the Crittenden Compromise ultimately failed. Why was it significant? The failure of this compromise means that secession is imminent. The purpose of this compromise was to arrest secession, to prevent secession, and it failed. So we get the first wave of secession. And I want to finish by talking about this first wave of secession. The secession in the lead up to the American Civil War happened in two waves. This is just the first wave. And the first wave of secession begins, of course, with South Carolina on December 20th, 1860. Rather than wait for Lincoln to be inaugurated, the following year in 1861, South Carolina takes the plunge first. On December 20th, South Carolina will vote to secede from the Union. South Carolina will be followed shortly by 6 other states of the Deep South. You can see on this map the first wave of secession. They're the ones in green. Those states are, in the order they left: Mississippi on January 9th, Florida the next day, Alabama the next day, Georgia on January 19th, Louisiana on January 26th, and on February 1st, 1861, the Lone Star State was the last. This was the first wave of secession. These 7 states left the Union based solely on the election of Abraham Lincoln. They believed, as I've said earlier, that his election, based upon a platform of 100% expansion of slavery, or 100% restriction of slavery's expansion, represented a revolution of the government. And they believed that in order to protect themselves, they needed to secede from the Union. They believed they had this right to do so because of what began with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and was taken to its logical conclusion by the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In late 1860, early 1861, 7 slave states will secede from the Union. They're known as the first wave of secession. And this is how the worst decade in American history, which began with compromise and ended with secession, this is how it all came to a close. Okay, so this concludes then part 3. We covered John Brown's raid, election of 1860, Crittenden Compromise, and the first wave of secession. So this concludes all of Unit 13. When you're done, make sure to review your notes, asking any questions, emailing me any questions you have. When you're ready, go ahead and take that Unit 13 quiz, and then when you're done, we'll move on to the last unit of the course, in which we're going to talk about the American Civil War.